session in our series on the Trump administration and the law, co-sponsored by the Law School and the Christopher and Lee Center on Law and Democracy. I'm Christina Chung, Executive Director of the Center for Law and Work. Today we'll be talking about the unprecedented and despotic attacks on the federal workforce through mass firings and layoffs of workers aimed at decimating federal civil service and politicizing it, orchestrated by Elon Musk and the so-called Department of Government Efficiency. The destruction of the federal workforce endangers vital public services that we rely on in profound ways, from education to healthcare, to affordable housing, to food and drug safety, to the safety of air travel and on highways, to consumer protection, to ensuring basic rights and protections for workers beyond just the public sector. The attacks on federal workers are also an attack on the ever-shrinking middle class in this country and the ability to secure decent-paying jobs and to access economic opportunities for people of all backgrounds. Federal jobs have historically provided economic opportunities, for example, for women, people of color, veterans, and individuals with disabilities. This afternoon, you'll be hearing from a panel of experts who will provide their insights into what is happening to federal workers, including the dismantling of agencies that enforce the rights of workers, both in civil service but also beyond, and also an examination of the claim that what's happening at the federal level somehow will increase government efficiency and achieve cost savings. Professor Catherine Fisk is the Barbara Nachtrieb Armstrong Distinguished Professor of Law at the Law School and a faculty director of the Center for Law and Work and the Center for Law and Technology. She is a nationally renowned scholar in the field of work law and is the third most cited labor and employment law scholar in the nation. Professor Diana Reddy, also a faculty director of the Center for Law and Work, is also an expert in the field of labor and employment law, and in addition to teaching courses in labor and employment law, also teaches exciting seminars on organized labor and civil rights, law and political economy, and social movement advocacy. And Professor Reddy and Aneja is an expert on how legal institutions affect social and economic inequalities, and his areas of focus include law and democracy, criminal justice, and law and economy, We will leave questions for the end of the session, so I think we should just go ahead and start, and I'll turn it over to the panel.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you so much to all of you that are here. We think this is an incredibly important panel, not just because attacks on federal workers are a threat to democracy, but because how we regulate work is very important for democracy. And so today we'll be talking not just about attacks on federal workers, but also on what the Trump administration has done and what we think it may do with regard to federal laws and federal agencies charged with protecting workers much more broadly. A word of a disclaimer that I think is important in any conversation about this administration. We don't know what is going to happen. If you do, please speak up. And also, things change daily. I was frantically Googling right before to see whether anything new had happened, new court decisions, new executive orders. And so we are very much trying to study something unprecedented as it happens in real time. So we're going to try to provide you some of the insights that come from our decades of working on these issues, both as to what is happening legally, but also to the kind of broader politics behind it. I think it's important, before we kick things off, to note that much of Trumpism and the kind of eclectic political views it has brought together, to the extent there is any coherency, has a lot to do with work. So to some extent, one of the kind of platforms on which Trump built some of his economic populism credentials was on a claim that there are workers who had been left behind. And a claim that his administration would do what previous administrations had failed to do, which is to protect those workers. That has, not always proven to be the case, as we will talk about. In the first Trump administration, there was, it was somewhat more like traditional Republicanism of late in terms of favoring management perspectives and employers over workers. What we are seeing today, again, have I mentioned it's unprecedented? It's unprecedented in part because of its evisceration of a federal workforce built over decades, centuries, that is kind of the cornerstone of the work of being a nation. It's unprecedented in its disregard for the value of civil servants and for the importance of some amount of political independence in a functioning bureaucracy. And yet, in fits and starts in other areas of administration policy, there remain claims to represent the interests of other workers, the forgotten workers harmed by free trade agreements and the failure to have an international trade strategy. And we see that with the enactment of unprecedented tariffs of questionable economic value. But I think one of the things that we're going to try and enforce is the extent to which his administration draws on real questions about what work should look like, which workers are protected, which workers should be protected, and which workers shouldn't, and what is needed to be done to kind of counter that narrative with a narrative that we think, although we all have our own varying views, that truly creates a work, an environment for work and a regulation of work that does promote actual democracy in the workplace and in our political system. So I think Catherine is going to kick us off with a discussion particularly of what has happened with the federal workforce, and we will go from there.
Great, thank you, Diana. As she said, we are seeing firings on a scale that has never previously been tried in American history. Over 100,000, according to CNN at last count. This is portrayed by the government as an effort to reduce costs and increase efficiency. There's no evidence that it will have that effect, and that's really Abe's expertise, and he'll talk about that when after I've described roughly what's going on. But what I think is clear that's happening is an extraordinary consolidation of discretionary power in the White House at the expense of every other branch of government or part of the executive branch, in violation of 150 years of civil service law, including the currently enforced Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. So let me describe the high points of this. First, there is, as I said, a consolidation of power both in the White House and particularly in the head of an agency known as the Office of Personnel Management, or OPM, which is essentially the HR office for the United States government. The director of OPM, a guy named Russell Vought, has said that his goal is for federal employees to be traumatically affected, that is, to inflict trauma on them, and that they be perceived as villains. That has not happened as a matter of government policy since the 1950s, when in the pursuit of communists in federal government, there were mass purges with no due process, no real investigation, no opportunity to prove that one was not a communist. I know this, my mother was a victim of it, but she was no communist. She was a registered Democrat and a Berkeley alum. So what has happened is an executive order gave OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, the unreviewable authority to determine the quote-unquote suitability of any and all federal employees. Formerly, that was power that was exercised by agency heads or supervisors, subject to review under the civil service law, and they're trying to consolidate it in OPM. A different executive order has sought to carve out a greater number of employees from civil service protections, to create a so-called schedule policy/career, which would accept from civil service any federal employee whose work touches on policy in any way, or who are involved in reviewing anything that has to do with policy. During the Biden administration, rules were adopted to prevent this carve-out, and currently they're trying to rescind those rules, but the president just announced he was doing it on January 20th as a matter of executive order. Third, last week, the president, by executive order, eliminated collective bargaining rights and the right to unionize for about 75% of the union-represented federal workers. So the Department of Homeland Security began this a few weeks before by unilaterally canceling its contracts covering the entirety of the Transportation Security Administration, the people who run those screening machines in the airports. But the executive order from March 27th expanded that by eliminating collective bargaining rights for virtually all employees of the Department of Justice, the Department of State, the Department of Treasury, the Veterans Administration, the Department of Homeland Security, the Departments of Energy, Interior, and others, along with agencies ranging from FEMA, which does emergency relief, the EPA, the National Science Foundation, the Federal Communications Commission, the General Services Administration, which runs all federal buildings, and the Social Security Administration. The asserted basis for this executive order was to protect national security. It's a dramatic overreading of provisions in the Civil Service Reform Act that exclude from collective bargaining employees of the CIA and the National Security Agency and the intelligence and counterintelligence employees of the FBI. And the president just decided that the intelligence exclusion authorizes a broad national security exclusion, and pretty much every federal employee, he says, is involved in national security, except, wait for it, police and anybody who actually does security in the federal government. One could look at this and conclude that's because, and indeed, the executive order is pretty clear about this, says the reason he's doing it is because the unions that represent federal civil servants have opposed the Trump attacks on the civil service through litigation and through protest. And so because of their opposition to his attacks, he's eliminating them. Next, as you probably know, because it's been covered extensively, there have been mass firings of all kinds of people, probationary employees, which for the most part are employees with a year or less of government service, depending. In some cases, it's 2 years, but it's just service in that particular position. And so it could actually be a federal employee with long federal service, and many are veterans because there is a veterans preference for federal jobs. And so this is a broad attack on, I think there are about 200,000, or were about 200,000 probationary employees before all these cuts. Then there's also been mass layoffs of non-probationary employees as part of the shutterings of various agencies. USAID and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau have gotten a lot of attention, as has the effort to shut down the entire Department of Education. But there have been dramatic cuts elsewhere, over 10,000 employees from various health agencies this week. And there were efforts to get rid of employees previously. You might have read about them or heard about them. Those so-called fork in the road email that went out in February, mirroring what Elon Musk did when he bought Twitter, basically trying to force people into either early retirement or just to take a little bit of garden leave, which means paid for a little while, but then agreeing to resign. There are also a variety of other things. Federal employees are required to submit, all federal employees, their 5 bullet points for what they did last week. I was talking to a former student who is a federal employee who says that his union offers them clever ideas about what to put in their bullet points. As well as bureaucratic entrepreneurs who are loyal to Trump and to Musk, the head of the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, which is really better understood as the Department of Government Control, are getting rid of employees on both a mass and an ad hoc basis. And of course, we're also seeing agencies firing employees because of the work they did, such as the FBI agents who worked on all the January 6th investigations, and the DOJ employees who either worked on those prosecutions or who had any part in the cases against Donald Trump. As well as employees are getting fired simply because they attended DEI trainings, as they were required to do in the prior administration. We are also seeing, of course, the dismantling of agencies that enforce the rights of both federal workers. The Merit Systems Protection Board is an independent agency that is where any wrongfully fired federal employee has to present their claim. The Federal Labor Relations Authority, which is the agency that administers the union and bargaining rights for all federal employees. Both of them, Trump fired their directors, notwithstanding, or their commissioners or members, notwithstanding the fact that Congress said they cannot be fired except for cause. And so, therefore, those agencies currently cannot function because they lack a quorum. As well as he fired the head of the Office of Special Counsel, which is the investigatory agency. It has no actual authority other than to look into things, that enforces not only the general civil service rights, but specific protections for whistleblowers who are protected because they're supposed to report waste, fraud, or abuse. And also enforces the statutory protections in effect since 1939 that protect federal employees against being required to take political positions consistent with the desires of the party in power, as well as the rights not to be forced to do political work on their off-duty time. And indeed, it also prohibits federal employees from doing a certain amount of off-duty work on their free time, which therefore means that the government could really do politically whatever it wants, and Abe will talk about how that has played out in the past. He also fired all the inspectors general, who are, most of them anyway, who are the people charged with investigating misconduct of any kind, including corruption, but also waste or fraud or other abuse in federal government. And so all of this is both getting rid of those people who enforce law, all law, as well as consolidating power in a variety of ways so that those who remain can be essentially forced to enforce the law or not according to the views of the party in power. And so I'm going to hand it over to Abe or Professor Aneja to talk about his empirical work on whether this increases efficiency or anything else.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, I think, it was really helpful to hear laid out all of the ways in which, what we think about as sort of the hallmarks and protections of formal civil service laws, what they are. And I think it's worth, and I think a lot, it's, I think, that the idea behind mass firings and restricting, traditional civil service protections, I think, are based on the idea that smaller and more politically accountable government, a smaller footprint and a more politically accountable set of bureaucrats will tend to increase efficiency. But I think it's worth recalling that for the first 100 years of the Republic, we more or less lived with a government in which the executive branch had more or less unlimited authority to remove bureaucrats in much the same way that we're sort of seeing authority being exercised today. So in the period from the late 18th century through the late 19th century, essentially what we saw was an extreme amount of turnover every 4 to 8 years with incoming presidential administrations. Again, in much the same way we're seeing this wave of firings now. The difference being that we tended to see it every time there was a presidential transition. And so my concern is that we're sort of introducing a new equilibrium in which we can expect a massive amount of bureaucratic turnover with some regularity. And the reason I think this is important is that this massive amount of turnover and instability, at least in my view, exacted an enormous cost on the quality of public services in this country. And that's what I've spent the last few years trying and document. Essentially, what was the effect of moving from a patronage-based system of staffing our federal government, which I think perhaps is arguably more in line with how the current administration views how we should staff the government and what the model has been for the last century, which is one in which we hire qualified bureaucrats regardless of their political persuasion, and we protect them from political interference so that they can do their jobs. And historically, what we've observed is that eliminating or sort of reducing the capacity of the executive branch to sort of interfere with the work of federal bureaucrats for political reasons, or to fire them for political reasons, tended to, so in other words, introducing what we think about as sort of standard civil service protections, it had enormous benefits for the quality of government services. And so, what I've observed is that when we think about, standard government services, in the case of my research, what I'm thinking about is the operation of the post office, which, I think to some degree we can think about as being one of the most basic services that our federal government provides. When we restricted the ability of presidents to fire clerks and carriers, letter carriers, just because they weren't members of the same political party, what that did was created incentives for these civil servants to invest in their own set of work-specific skills, or committed them to the mission of good government, for periods that lasted, beyond just 4 to 8 years. Rather, these were government workers who could rest assured that they would be employed by the government for an extended period of time. And so they had both the incentive and the ability to sort of become effective civil servants, effective government workers. This really tended to improve the quality of services that citizens received. And so I just think it's worth remembering what providing protections to our bureaucrats has done for the quality of government.
And so I will chime in now with kind of a report and reflection on what the Trump administration has meant for labor and employment policy outside of the federal government. I think we can all agree that in terms of federal public employment, we can characterize the attitude of the Trump administration as truly anti-federal worker, and really kind of passionately so, right? With really kind of both taking away legal protections and justifying it as having to do with both the inefficiency of the federal government and the potential lack of loyalty within the federal government. So very much treating the career civil service folks as the enemy in any number of ways. It's interesting to juxtapose that with how the Trump administration both talks about and treats workers outside the federal government. And here I want to emphasize, to some extent, the frenetic nature of both the language and the actual policy choices, as well as the appointments. And I do this not to say, in case anyone's concerned, that I think this administration is a champion of any workers. But I think it's really important to emphasize the political and social context into which that gave us this administration, and the kind of really entrenched and structural institutional inequalities that I think have created the opportunity for where we are today. So with regard to how the federal government administers labor and employment policy for all workers, there are, responsibility for that is lodged in several different agencies, in an arguably, perhaps not the best, most efficient organization of tasks, but that reflects the fact that our labor and employment policy as a nation has evolved in fits and starts over periods of time. And so, we had the development of labor law and collective bargaining protections for private sector employees during the New Deal, and that resulted in the creation of the National Labor Relations Board, an independent agency that administers our federal collective bargaining policy. We also then have the creation of the Department of Labor, which tends to deal more with minimum standards legislation and employee benefits and things that are protections that we provide to employees as individuals. And then we have the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, created in the 1960s after the enactment of Title VII, that administers employment discrimination law. And as I talk about in my work law class, for those of you who have taken it, there are reasons for this segmentation of labor policy, but there are also real, I think, downsides, both for efficiency's sake and also for how we think about what matters at work. And historically, too often, the folks who have thought about collective bargaining have not thought about discrimination. And the folks who have thought about discrimination have not thought about collective bargaining. And what I teach in work law is that these are all really interconnected. And that to have policy that works for all workers, we need to think about how worker power can be a mechanism of anti-discrimination, and how minimum standards can change the balance of power in the workplace. And so with regard to these different agencies, it's really kind of remarkable to see the kind of variation in where the Trump administration has gone. So at the National Labor Relations Board, President Trump immediately fired the general counsel, but as you know, that was not unprecedented because President Biden had done that, had fired the previously appointed general counsel. So that is, there was some, by custom, we had allowed the general counsel of the agency to continue their term, but starting with President Biden, there was a move to say, nope, like immediately we are going to replace this role with someone who has our political values. There were legal challenges to that when President Biden did it, and those were not successful. And so, I think generally it's understood that is something in which there is greater flexibility. What President Trump did this time, though, which is unprecedented and not been done before, is fire the chair of the board itself, Gwen Wilcox, the first African-American woman to hold that position, and in so doing rendered the NLRB without a quorum. Which means that it is defunct for the moment, at least at the board level. So the regional offices are able to continue processing cases, both unfair labor practice cases and representation cases, but if something is appealed to the board is unable to issue decisions. This actually creates a somewhat complicated political situation because to the extent President Trump wants to undo the kind of really remarkably pro-labor policies of his predecessor, it will take a constituted board to do that. So I think the politics of there is precedent. There was several years under previous presidencies when we did not have a functional National Labor Relations Board, and that was harmful for kind of our unions. And so there's kind of speculation. Will he appoint people? Will he not? In order to undo President Biden's policies, he will need to appoint people, but also perhaps he will just let, the law increasingly be unenforced. Such that employers can appeal things to the board, and as long as there is no resolution, there's not going to be any remedy available for workers. So the acting general counsel, who is management side at the NLRB, has rescinded a number of Biden-era general counsel memos that I've written elsewhere were kind of really incredible advances in the recent history, at least, of administrative labor law. But again, the general counsel does not have, has limited power. The general counsel cannot overturn decisions by the board. So there is a sort of limbo there. I will say, to point to kind of the esotericness and, is there a through line here? If for those of you who have heard of the CEMEX decision that was issued under the Biden board, which, again, was a kind of really remarkable move in terms of labor policy, both to make it easier for unions to be voluntarily recognized, and to make it easier to get bargaining orders such that when employers engage in unfair labor practices, there's a lower standard for unions negatively affected by that to just to receive an order saying, employer, you must bargain with them, right? You have interfered with this process, and so we no longer kind of trust it, and we are going to say that impose a really meaningful penalty that says you have to go ahead and bargain. There was recently, I believe, a case involving Starbucks in which the regional director had been pursuing a CEMEX bargaining order, consistent with the last administration's policy. And then, of course, we had the new administration take office, and there was a pause in the proceedings so that the director could ask, "Are we still doing this?" And for whatever reason, I don't know what, they said yes. Notwithstanding, the dismantling of the board itself, there was at least some continuation of what is a remarkably kind of like pro-labor policy, at least for the moment. At the Department of Labor, we have seen the nomination and confirmation of Lori Chavez-Remmer as Secretary of Labor. There's kind of great debate about her political bona fides, but I think at minimum there is somewhat broad agreement that she's not the worst. That there are much kind of that she has some. She historically has had some meaningful pro-labor beliefs, although from a conservative standpoint, she has been forced to walk back many of those in order to be confirmed. But I think it's really important to mention that there were many components of the kind of, the Trump melange that were really opposed to her nomination. So there were articles that said, "Don't let the Teamsters pick our Secretary of Labor," because in part it was the Teamsters who had exercised the kind of influence that it was understood to help her be Secretary of Labor. Just, I think today or yesterday, Jonathan Berry, a management side attorney, was nominated to be the labor solicitor. Like I said, I printed things out this morning. This is him. He is also the author of the Department of Labor and Related Agencies chapter of Project 2025. That said, again, to point to the kind of really complicated politics of this all, this is a document that is, really anti- DEI. This is a document that calls into question whether we should still protect overtime in the same way. It is a very, very kind of conservative anti-worker document in some ways, and yet there are moments in which it reflects, and in the voice of Jonathan Berry, a commitment to the core purposes, as he calls them, of unions, and in particular a belief that the NLRB should be seeking more 10J injunctions against employers who commit unfair labor practices. There's also a recommendation that employers should provide daycare on site. I don't know how central that will be to the policy, but I think it reflects this kind of, very family-focused vision of work. So saying, well, if women are going to have to work, right, we will at least have daycare. At the same time, I would love. Can we get? I would love some daycare right on. If you could talk to. So just to, again, reflect the complexity of kind of the conservative, evolving vision of conservative labor policy. The EEOC is also now without a quorum due to the firings of President Trump. And at the same time, he has the instructions to the EEOC are not to back off. They're not to do less. Rather, the EEOC is being charged with being an enforcement agency, enforcing the Trump administration's understanding of anti-discrimination. So charged with rooting out and eliminating DEI initiatives in the workplace, and also with fighting back against Biden's gender ideology, and interestingly taking a stance on anti-American national origin discrimination. Which again, we may think of as kind of, a classic overinflated, reverse discrimination claim. And yet, particularly here in the Bay Area and Silicon Valley, there actually have been a number of cases about employers' use of some of the H-1B visa processes in which, juries have found an anti-American bias in employer hiring. So again, what are we to make of this? I will just say I think it's really important to think about the differences in private and public sector employment and how they reflect broader kind of stratification in our society. For one, the public sector unionization rate is over 30%, and even higher in certain areas. Meanwhile, the private sector unionization rate is under 6%, I believe, at the last measure. The union movement in the U.S. is currently, in terms of numbers, about half public sector employees and half private sector, which is, a bizarre kind of really reversal of what things looked like when we talk about the peak of American union density in the 1950s, where public sector employees did not have collective bargaining rights, but, we had, 40% or of private sector workers in a union. I think it's also important to talk about the educational differences. So according to the most recent statistics, in the private sector, 45% of workers have a high school degree or less. And that's only 25% of the federal government. The federal government is the most educated workplace compared to private sector, state government, local government. And as we also know, union membership to some extent and increasingly educational attainment are some of the characteristics most associated with political orientation, right? So they're increasingly, having a college degree and having a graduate degree are very much associated with voting for liberals and for Democrats in a real switch from what things used to be like, right? Where it used to be that kind of Democrats were the party of the working class and the less educated, and now we see this real schism. So I don't, I'm not trying to say there is reason to the madness, although I think there is strategy. To some extent, I think this is an attempt to further divisions within the working class that already exist, based on race, based on immigration status, based on educational attainment. I think something that perhaps the academy hasn't focused enough on, in part because of, we tend to be homogenous in terms of our educational attainment. I think these are really kind of important social divisions that have both economic and symbolic meaning to workers, and there hasn't been enough done to really think about how to build solidarity across this fractured working class. And so, in terms of a response, well, we can talk more about this, but I think it is, incredibly important to try to find greater unity across, for instance, the public sector and the private sector, across workers with different levels of educational attainment, and to think about what kinds of labor policies protect all workers if we are going to have a response to this moment. Anything else, y'all? Questions?
Let's have some questions. I'm sure the three of us could talk at you quite a bit, but we'd love to know what you're thinking.
Go for it.
Thank you. I also missed the last 10 minutes, so I'll candidly say that I'm asking a question you already covered. I'm curious about, obviously the firings and everything's happening is incredibly extreme and alarming, and I'm curious if the relationship of what's happening and also empirical studies of the transition into protected civil servants, the intersection of this also sort of the outsourcing of work for the federal government through consultants, and the strain that has posed for full-time employees. So I'm curious, from empirical studies and that transition, how you've seen that relationship work, and also sort of what's happening now in the relationship of
I must admit, I don't know of much evidence. I'm sure there is. I'm just not familiar with what the social science literature has to say about contracting out civil service. Contracting out performance of federal services. Is that kind of what the question is? Yeah, it's a good question. I guess without knowing that literature, my concern, I guess, is it remains that there are just sort of costs to insulating those who perform public functions from political interference. And I think that, at least at first blush, I would be sort of concerned that, that protection may not be there for contractors who are hired to sort of perform government functions. They, I guess, almost by design actually are sort of reliant on continual commitments from the executive branch or whatever branch to generate an income stream. So I have some concerns, but I must admit I don't really know what evidence is out there.
Yeah, I think I don't know a lot more than what Abe just said. They're terminating, of course, a lot of contracts. And one of the questions that I think time will tell, because we've never seen this, we just don't have enough study of what the likely effect will be. But of course, contracts have to have two parties. You have to have somebody to monitor contract compliance on the government side, which requires expertise comparable to the expertise on the contracting side. And, Abe mentioned the American history prior to the 1883 adoption of civil service law. You can have a high level of turnover and not a lot of expertise if the services that are being provided don't require a great deal of education, training, institutional memory. Although, some of his work is on the Postal Service, and even for relatively unskilled work like operating the Postal Service, especially mail delivery, still he finds in his work, he didn't tout it enough, that during the Wilson administration, Woodrow Wilson administration, when there was massive race-based layoffs of postal workers, the quality of postal service, the accuracy of mail delivery declined. But if you focus on highly skilled work that didn't exist to the same extent in the United States prior to the later 19th century, you could have ineptitude in the tariff department, which was a big part of the government service in the 1820s. Even the government work prior to the administration of Andrew Jackson, which began in 1829, if you don't remember your U.S. history or never studied it, they didn't tend to have a huge amount of turnover from one president to the next, even when the White House switched parties, in part because they counted on consistency for the work that was done, and at that time, some of it was not super high-skilled. During the Civil War, when President Lincoln sort of used patronage appointments to keep his political coalition together, there were terrible problems with the competence of government service, quality of government contracts, because they didn't have expertise on the government side. They were using government jobs as a reward for political loyalists to try and keep what was left of the Union together. And it was one reason why there was a real push for civil service laws after the Civil War, is because of the terrible quality of goods and services that the government was receiving and that the public were receiving. So you simply can't, right? We could all worry about, Boeing contracting with the government for new planes if there's nobody on the government side to monitor the quality of the contract. And of course, there could also be huge corruption problems. Who gets the government contract? If there's no protected civil servant handling the bidding, we know who's going to get the government contract. And then finally, the other thing I'll say is that some states have experimented with abolishing civil service protection. Georgia did several years ago. And what they discovered was dissatisfaction with the quality of government service because, again, there would be a high degree of turnover. You don't attract good people to the work. And that's for work that may not be comparable to, the committee every year that decides what the flu vaccine should look like. You might have read the Trump administration canceled those meetings. As somebody who gets the flu vaccine every year and works where there are a lot of people who are exposed to a lot of people, I'm terrified at the thought that the flu vaccine will be useless because we will all be much sicker next year than we were this year or the year before. And so the sort of concern about good quality science, which is a huge part of what the government does, is concern. Yeah.
Hey guys, I'm curious about the tariffs that went in yesterday and where you all expect that to hit in terms of workers and what types of workers you see being the most impacted by those. I know it's hard to predict, but I'm curious your thoughts.
It's a fantastic question. It's incredibly, it's so important. And I think it is, again, part of the Trump administration's kind of worker agenda is to take on issues that were traditionally, not addressed by, Republicans or by Democrats. I have not followed the kind of real analyses of what they are likely to do. I have only seen kind of the media reports, which are really interesting because on the one hand, you see kind of, business folks being like, this will ruin everything. It'll make it hard for us to be competitive and then we won't be able to provide jobs for folks. And then I think kind of, the left, of just like, to some extent, we oppose everything that the Trump administration does. I think there is some understanding that tariffs can be protective for some workers, but I have not looked at the numbers.
Well, and, to the extent that they are imposed today, with the hope that it's going to result in car manufacturing coming back to the upper Midwest, or textiles coming back to the textile industry was, before it went overseas, was in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Before that, it was in New England and the mid-Atlantic states, right? You can't just reopen a textile mill like that if it's been closed for a long time. There are some companies that are trying to bring clothing manufacturing back to the U.S., but where it's been successful, it's with a mill that hadn't been closed yet and a workforce that hadn't been laid off, and the machines had been kept up to date and hadn't been sold off for scrap. So that's the Buck Mason model that you might have read about. They took over an existing mill in Pennsylvania. And so I think there's going to be real questions about how long it's going to take to for this to result in jobs being onshored again.
I'm not super well-informed in this realm, so this might not go anywhere, but I was just thinking a lot about, universities as also being a site of a lot of attack right now, and thinking about them also being a site, especially these public universities, of a lot of union action and people with different levels of educational access and attainment who are employed on these campuses. Like, is there any room for union organizing, labor movement, like, as a pushback to kind of the repression that's happening and the way that universities are caving to the Trump administration, also just placing ourselves in the conversation?
So I went to the town hall that was in Booth Auditorium on Tuesday afternoon to hear the chancellor of this campus, the provost of this campus, and some other people talk about their reaction, and also faculty. It was organized by a faculty organization. And so one of the things I noticed was, although, at least on this campus, although the threat to cut off federal funds would not hit equally across departments. You know, unless they eliminate student loans, the law school will not be decimated. Biology, molecular biology, the physical sciences, the biological sciences, and some social sciences will be hit really hard. So I was intrigued, as well as public health. And of course, Berkeley doesn't have a medical school, which means in billions of dollars, the hit on us would be much less than the hit on UC San Francisco or UCLA or UC San Diego, all of which have big medical schools that do a lot of federally funded research, as well as treat patients who subject to Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera. So what I heard, at least, was both a fair amount of solidarity among faculty of recognizing we are all in this together, even if in biology or physics it's going to hit grad students and postdocs hard and immediately, and in the law school or in the English department, the hit won't be immediate. And so sort of a determination of, look, they're coming for all of us. Let's stand together, as well as I was encouraged to see this administration, which sometimes can get a little crosswise with the unions, be much more focused on, nothing like having a common enemy to make us put aside our usual internecine struggles. And so I think it's a little too soon to tell how this is going to prompt greater unionization specifically. But I think what we are seeing is sort of proto-unionization among non-union people, like most of the faculty at this campus is not unionized, and we don't bargain collectively. The podium faculty, the tenure track faculty like us, as opposed to the lecturers who are unionized, and their union has bargained for quite some number of years. So I think what we're trying to do is find solidarity across difference, and from that, all good things can happen.
Oh, I so want to let that be the last word, since we're at time. But I guess the one thing I will say on that account is that, so, one of the things I didn't mention is that there's a number of lawsuits arguing that the National Labor Relations Board is unconstitutional. For those of you who remember, your American history, it was found to be constitutional back in 1937. And, at the time, it was very unclear if it would be found unconstitutional. And I think one of the things that's understood to have made such a big difference is the massive amount of worker action, the massive amount of kind of strikes in really important industries. And I think what's so hard about the moment we're in today is that, yes, I think there's an incredibly important role for union response, but as I mentioned, the private sector is really low in its union density, and the public sector is where we have so much union power. And I think there's a question of, does it matter to this administration if public workers go on strike? I mean, they might welcome it, right? I mean, we'll see when push comes to shove. I mean, at some point they do need workers, but to the extent they're saying we don't want the public sector anymore, how much real material power do public sector workers have? And I think one of the things that I'm somewhat surprised to see is that there haven't been massive actions by private sector unions in opposition to what's happening in the public sector. To me, that would have seemed obvious, especially for unions that have members across both. And yet that it has not yet happened. And I think that may have something to do with some of the divisions that we've talked about where we don't fully see our interests in each other. And so I think that's where that's where I hope we see the role of unions in building that kind of vision of a shared good across all of these divisions. We're at time.
That's a good way to end. Yours. Thank you.